Okay, so let's get started for today. I'm going to briefly tell you guys what the plan is. So from until about 10, we're going to have Simon Lindgren, who's here. He's the director of the Digital Sociology Center in Umeå. So he'll talk us about what is digital sociology, and then he'll log on to his Linux server in Umeå and show us some stuff in action.
Hope so.
And, all right. So and then after that we'll have Amelia talk to us about law, and David Sumter hopefully will be here at 10:30 to briefly talk about this mathematics for social activism workshop from June 4th to 5th. Okay, so let's
as Russ said, I'm Simon Lindgren. I work at the Department of Sociology at Umeå University. I'm also the coordinator of a network for digital social research, as we call it, like researchers in the social sciences that are interested in all different aspects of digitalization. So that includes people from the law department, from the sociology department, from education, from informatics and so on. But in my case, as I'm a sociologist, I have a specific perspective within this, and I used to be what you'd call like a qualitative sociologist, doing interpretive text analysis, that type of thing. But in the last 10 years or so, maybe 15 now, I've been moving more and more into the field of internet research, which means that I've also started to incorporate data science stuff in my research as well. But what I'll give you now is an introduction to digital sociology. So this will sort of be a brief introduction to sociological thinking about the digital society and social media at a quite general conceptual level first. So quite theoretical and very much about like ideas about why it's interesting from a sociological perspective to study social media and the internet and interaction there. And then I'll move on to a case presentation about a study that I did about the Me Too hashtag, where some of these, at least some of these questions will be sort of shown in practice. So, digital sociology, this is the introduction. So, the discipline of sociology started out trying to understand industrial society, like at the beginning of or maybe at the turn between the 1800s and the 1900s and even before. And then very much focus was to understand like social processes in the industrial society, because when you move from an agrarian society to the industrial society, lots of social patterns change. So it's, for example, how people organize their everyday lives, how gender, class, kinship, all those types of relations are acted out and so on. Consumption patterns of working life, everything changes. And it's been taught in sociology maybe since 20, 30 years back, that now we're entering a new era. Something comes after the industrial era that was characterized by capitalism and wage labor and that whole system. And there have been many suggestions as to what this society should be. It's been called an information society. It's been called by some theorists a post-modern society. And within my field, we would say that this change is very much driven by the digitalization of society. And that this then is like a major social shift, which means that we must revise theories and we also get new opportunities to analyze society. One interesting discussion, which is sort of a peculiarity somehow, but also quite points to some interesting things, is the discussion in internet research, whether we should write internet with a capital I or with a small I. If we relate it to, for example, the parallel instance of radio, for example. We talk of radio not with a capital R. We talk of radio as a medium that sort of exists in society and is like an everyday medium. So is the internet like a place, a cultural thing, or is it more like a branded thing that is a very specific technology? And if we write it without the capital I, we say that it's actually a medium that's very much enmeshed in society rather than just pointing to the particular system that was developed in the US starting in the 50s, 60s, and has a very sort of technological material presence. I'll try to explain more what I mean about this. But when we discuss digitalization, one sort of modern classic formulation is Melvin Kranzberg, who is a technology historian, a historian of technology, formulated something called Kranzberg's first law about how technology affects society. And I'm going to read what he says there in this very often quoted paragraph. It says, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And then he continues to say that technology's interaction with the social ecology is such that technical developments frequently have environmental, social, and human consequences that go far beyond the immediate purposes of the technical devices and practices themselves. And the same technology can have quite different results when introduced into different contexts or under different circumstances. So sociologists is not very much interested in the exact technological infrastructure of the internet. We would be more interested in the consequences of, in this case, the internet and social media. How do they change social processes among people? How does it change how we organize collectively? How does it change everyday interactions? How does it change the social psychology in meetings between people and that type of thing? So those are the general questions. We're also then interested in digital media and social change. I'll return to that with a quote from media theorist Marshall McLuhan quite soon, but it has to do with what's the relationship between internet, social media, and social change. Also in our field, we have this ongoing division between what we could call cyber optimism and cyber pessimism, digital optimism, digital pessimism, which is a long-standing debate that we can say lots of things about. But generally, the early internet research literature that came out in the mid to late 90s was largely of the optimistic type, said that you can be anyone you like on the internet. It's a free playing field for developing your own identity. You're no longer bound by such things like your social background, your gender, your disabilities, your all other types of like social stratification criteria. So now we will have a new form of direct democracy. We will have all these divisions between, let's say, politician and citizen, or between expert and amateur. Everything will sort of be possible now. And also that was sort of related to some of the late 60s hippie ideals that actually existed among many of these like more utopian people in the computer science departments in some California universities where this was developed, this tool. But then we've also had this perspective, the cyber pessimist perspective. And I think those who sort of represent this perspective wouldn't call themselves pessimists. They would say, I'm a realist, or I have a critical perspective. And today, with data scandals and with these issues of surveillance, and also with ongoing problems with online hate speech and stuff, we can see that this same technology that enables lots of good things in society can also change society for the worse. But the important thing from a sociological perspective, I would say, would be to get beyond this technological determinism, which would mean that if we implement a certain technology, for example, the internet in society or an iPad in a classroom, whatever, at any different level, we will get certain outcomes, because that's what was formulated in this law by Kranzberg. It says that different technologies will get, or one and the same technology will get different outcomes in different settings. So just because you give people the internet, they won't necessarily, in a totalitarian state, you can't be sure that that will guarantee a revolution. But maybe it couldn't be an enabling factor in it, or maybe it could even be a tool for the totalitarian government to control the society even more. So there's also related to this theoretical framework around what's called the social shaping of technology. So once again, it's the same. It's like both the implementation and the design of technologies and their uses are dependent on social and historical patterns. And the really good thing, being a researcher and trying to get across this perspective, is then we never know. It's always an empirical question. What effects did the technology get? What processes were set in motion in this particular case? So there's always need for more research, because just because it has a certain effect during the Arab Spring, we can't be sure that it has the exact same effect in the Trump election, because maybe it's similar characteristics of the technology, the same organizational patterns that enable both like neo-Nazis and feminists to do their thing with these platforms and also counteract each other. So there's a lot of different concepts to describe this, but one idea from sociologists that we see that one of the first things we teach in sociology on the first semester is like that some of the sociological key concepts, where one is the structure and agency, where we say that people can act freely somehow, but they also do this in relation to social structures, which can be like both the laws and the regulations, but also even more maybe conventions and customs and expectations, those types of things. And structures then are defined as things that enable and limit our ways of acting. And there's a connection there to what the informatics people discuss as affordances of technology, that there's some opportunities to act with different technologies. For example, with a book, there's no moving images. With a radio, you can't talk back with the usual FM radio. And with a website without a comment field below the article, there's not the affordance to talk back, but if you have a comment section, you can talk back and so on. A technology like Skype or FaceTime allows for real-time interaction, at least close to real-time, while email doesn't. So these structures enable what we can do and not, which means that some sort of things can be done with the help of Facebook groups, some things can be done with email, some things can be done with Twitter and so on, and there's a different social dynamic to this. So one thing that's new, I would say, from a sociological perspective with the society of internet and social media is this increased prevalence of user-created content, which means that actually we talk about this lots in the early 2000s as it was a new insight, but there's a futurologist, whatever that means, but like a researcher who wants to say stuff about what society will have in the future, called Alvin Toffler, who wrote some books in the early 1980s. And in one of these books, he wrote about a new social type that was emerging in relation to the new media at the time. And he says then that people today, and this was in 1980, become more at ease in the midst of this bombardment of blips, like this fragmented media culture. He says that the 90-second news clip intercut with a 30-second commercial, a fragment of song and lyric, a headline, a cartoon, a collage, a newsletter item, a computer printout. Rather than trying to stuff the new modular data into the standard categories or frameworks, they learn to make their own, to form their own strings out of the blipped material shot at them. And this is sort of the same attitude that people have on social media today, that we have to navigate between lots of different platforms. We are both served our personalized feeds with these side effects like filter bubbles and echo chambers, but we also create our own feeds in terms of what we put out and what we post and so on. So this is a new thing that when we study, at least from the perspective of media sociology, the texts we find in the public sphere are produced by regular people to a much larger extent than they were before. There's also at a sort of deeper level many different dynamics that change. For example, a sociologist called Joshua Meyrowitz in a book from 1985 called No Sense of Place put forth this idea that's quite sort of common sense today, that in this type of society characterized by new electronic media, the importance of place diminishes, which means that take a movement like Me Too, for example. It's possible to mobilize globally in a new way with issues that are not rooted in a specific locality, and they can also be both. So generally then we can say that we see these media, these platforms, as environments where people act. But it also aligns well with the general sociological perspective, because social environments are also media. If we define medium as sort of means of communication and interaction, because a cafeteria is also a medium and Twitter is a medium. So we sort of translate that theory. Things have also changed, of course. First we had the internet with BBS systems and like the pre-World Wide Web internet. Then we've had this development through what's been defined as Web 1.0, which is the more static, less interactive internet. If you remember, like what a newspaper website looked like in maybe 1998 or something like that. There were not very much interactive features. It was actually maybe worse than the paper counterpart to convey the message, because it had less images, it was less dynamically formatted and stuff, and there was no opportunity to talk back. Then we have the Web 2.0 revolution, which includes this these things that happened in the early 2000s with blogging, the blogging sort of revolution, the talk of the blogosphere, and also lots of these like social linking and tagging services that came out. And then soon after that, there's been discussion about what Web 3.0 would be, but I would say the next step is sort of social media then, with the rise of Facebook and YouTube and all of Google services and Instagram and Twitter and Snapchat and whatever after that, where it's much more about both things happen on the internet, on the same physical infrastructure, but it's different behaviors. And they're driven by business, but also driven by users. But a British sociologist named David Gauntlet has, in a book called Making Connecting, defined social media with 3 bullet points. It says that social media is a framework for participation. It's content agnostic. It doesn't say what you're supposed to put there. YouTube, for example, is an infrastructure, but it doesn't say that these are videos about this or this. You can develop communities within it dynamically. And that's the next point. It has community features. So some sort of friending, linking, grouping mechanic. And I won't go so much deeper into the sociological theories, but just these are names of theoretical classics that we teach on the basic courses of sociology, and there are in fact, like in this field of digital media studies, connections all the way back, because what these classic sociologists, Emil Durkheim, for example, he was interested in what he called social facts, like things that are created collectively and then affect the individual. And he didn't know about hashtags or memes or viral media, but it can be applied there. Max Weber, another sociologist, was interested in social action, saying that the interesting thing for sociologists is not what people do in general, but stuff they do that are directed towards other people and that sort of are interpreted and circulated in a social setting. So that's also something that happens on social media. Georg Simmel, a German sociologist, was interested in social presence, like what parts of our individuality is visible to others. And that's also related to social psychologist Erving Goffman's writings about self-presentation, that we manage our impressions all the time. We choose our clothing, we choose our way of speaking, we're also socialized into certain ways of speaking. So what this points out is basically, why is social media called social media? Yes, because people do social things, and those social things are quite timeless, because these theories were developed in the late 1800s. So what do we want to get at when we study social media empirically? An American internet scholar called Mimi Ito formulated this idea about networked publics, saying that with social media platforms, people are already mobilized. We already have our social networks. So if something happens, we want to arrange a manifestation about something, for example. We already have our social networks. We're already mobilized. We already have an app on a phone in our pocket where we are networked with people. So we can just throw something out there and move all of these degrees of separation through a network very quickly, which means that there's some sort of tactical advantage that the general public has. So there's several changed conditions for social interaction at the social psychological level as well that we can study when we study social patterns on the internet. For example, sociologist Manuel Castells wrote three books, a trilogy in the late 90s about the network society, where he talks about the space of flows. That also echoes this idea about no space of play, no sense of place. Like when people communicate online, we're not doing this communication in a certain physical location. We're not doing it in the space of places. We're communicating in the space of flows. And the things that we communicate in this space of flows can get different consequences in different spaces of places. Also, James Stuhler, a psychologist, wrote a very much cited paper in 2004 about the online disinhibition effect, where he says basically that because of the relative anonymity, we're seldom completely anonymous, but we're relatively anonymous, faceless, disembodied. And because of the relatively asynchronous character of internet communication. I mean, we can communicate in real time, but often we don't see the exact effects of what we say immediately. That makes us sort of dare to do more, even if it's asking someone out on a date, or if it is saying that you hate people with a certain skin color. The threshold is lowered. If you have an impulse, it's easier to do it protected by these two things. You don't have to deal with it immediately, and you're not completely visible. And he defined this as the online disinhibition effect, that we become disinhibited online. And this is an example of why it's important to not have this determinist perspective, because the same platform that can bring people together to do good things can obviously bring people together to do bad things. Just like a person in the Swedish rural area with a rare disability that's isolated can find like-minded people and find a meaning to life through the internet. We can also mobilize terrorist network or hate networks with the very same affordances. So yeah, we can build community and we can create networks. And two theoretical concepts related to that are quite interesting is an educational scholar called James Paul G, maybe it's pronounced, G-E-E is the spelling, who discusses something that he calls affinity spaces. He says that people can create online these affinity spaces where it's not who you are that what drives interaction, but a sort of common project. So there's a low threshold to participation. You can enter in this forum, which is about a certain game or a certain political issue or something like that. People will recognize you from just a small number of markers, and you will feel affinity very quickly. Sometimes these spaces are established on social media, sometimes they're not. But also there's been a move from a focus on online communities and in the age of social media more towards the notion of networks, where there's also been a revival in sociology of network science, which was a bit of a more obscure specialty in sociology before, that had its golden age maybe in the early 70s. And there's this idea about network individualism today that comes from a book called Networked, I think, by Lee Rainey and Barry Wellman, who says that we must focus today not on communities as static communities, because every individual is at the center of his or her own network, and it's these networks that we need to sort of focus on, because no person's network is the same as the other person's. But what you can bring with you from this is basically the notions of communities and networks. Also, now close to wrapping up this section, the notion of the public sphere is something that comes from a German sociologist called Jürgen Habermas, who has focused what opportunities do people have to mobilize democratically. And he has this way of describing history where he says that in the 1700s there was a golden age for the public sphere. People were meeting in European coffee houses, talking about the big issues of the time. There was a democratic debate among citizens that was outside of the sort of official institutions. It could be a counter public that could criticize people in power and so on. Then there's the issue that not everyone had access to these places in terms of gender and class, but still he idealizes this. And then he paints a picture of history where he says that now this public sphere has become fragmented in the sort of mass media society of the 60s, 70s. And people have been sort of dumbed down, sort of. They're not as critical, don't discuss political issues as much. And then there's been this idea that maybe the internet, and he's still active himself, even though he's sort of old school theorist that was active already in the mid 20th century. He says that maybe the internet can revive the public sphere. Maybe the internet can be this democratic arena where people can mobilize politically. So in relation to these coffee houses, there's been talk about the notion of cyber salons, like these spaces online where people can have this same democratic debate. But still then, there's also the critical perspective, like who has access? There's always the digital divides, not only in terms of geography, because the internet is sort of all over the globe now, but there are other differences in access, like which social groups uses the internet for which things. For example, just because you use the internet, you can use it for you can look up football scores on the website of a tabloid magazine, or you can be like a political blogger, but you still use the internet, so it's a difference. And also, lots of these more hardcore network analysis of the internet also show that there's this power law distribution almost everywhere on the internet. Like a small amount of people is doing most of the posting, and even though we can get an illusion that there's large numbers, there's always this pattern of power and authority. There's also this idea about connective action, which is launched by two writers in a paper from 2012, Lance Bennett and Alexandra Segerberg, who is actually at Stockholm University, where they say, we're now in an era not of collective action, but an era of connective action. And I'm going to say something more about that with my empirical case that I'm getting to now. But to sum up like this expose, from which you can sort of take with you what you like or what you feel is interesting, I would say that when you then move as a sociologist into the domain of data science, the types of issues you would be interested in would be like looking at the content of what people post, trying to get at stuff like as how identity is formed, how communities are formed, which structures networks have, how political discourse, like different ideological packages are structured and by whom, to see how society is organized, how people mobilize, also patterns of dominance, resistance, and power and subordination. So I'll move on now with this example of the case study that I made, which was of the Me Too movement. So I'm just going to make a little switch here in my notes view. Sorry. Yeah, this is a study that I made. It's not published yet. It's under review at the moment. It's an example of how I work, picking up some of these quite basic sociological issues in a very sort of concrete, empirical example. So this is the sort of working title for the paper, but let's move on to why I did this study. The Me Too movement that sort of exploded on social media in late 2017, it was obviously like a big thing in society. It's of sociological interest. It made a global impact on the debate about gender and power and violence and so on. It's also, from a more narrow perspective, like if we go to sort of the internet sociology, it's an example of this phenomenon that has been discussed as hashtag activism. There's lots of cases of this, you've seen like from the Ice Bucket Challenge and from Bring Back Our Girls and Black Lives Matter, and yeah, lots of these hashtags that are used for mobilizing people around political issues. But still, we don't know very much about how these movements work. And from my sociological perspective, then what I was interested in was also to try to look at how can we develop perspectives on social movements. Do social movements work in a different way in these types of cases, as opposed to what theories about social movements that were developed in the maybe second half of the 20th century say? Do we need to revise the theories, or are they still valid for these patterns that we see today? And this is such a large-scale movement that it's sort of a good case to study. It's an opportunity, as it says there, to get new knowledge about social media mobilization. And also in the face of lots of these challenges, because not all movements are successful. There's a challenge to sort of break through the noise. It's a challenge in actually maintaining your momentum and all these types of things. So then I discuss in my paper different theoretical dimensions about how the movement frames its issue, which platforms it uses, and if it functions in different ways throughout different phases of the campaign. Yeah, so I think I covered most of the things that are on this slide as well. Yeah, there's an emerging research field around social movements online. I will look at how this movement emerged, and there's also a need to study digital mobilization empirically because we don't know enough about it yet. So I had this large data set of tweets, or I collected it. So it was around, I think it was initially around 4 million tweets, but I did some cleaning about which languages I kept and did some other data cleaning. So the data set I had that I worked with was around 3 million tweets. I collected these from the Twitter API, the application programming interface. I'll show you the practical side of this later on. But also for one of my research questions, I was interested in how this movement or this campaign, whatever we should define it, I say campaign here, moved to other platforms, such as Facebook's blogs and YouTube. Because I was interested which there's a pointer here, I think. Let's see if I can. This is the pointer. Yeah. The fourth research question here was about the migration across platforms of the campaign. But I also wanted to see how did the campaign maintain its focus, did the sort of tone of the campaign change, and also the notion of clicktivism in the campaign. Because from the more, if we turn to this more cyber pessimist or the critical perspective, there's this idea that these large-scale movements that are very much celebrated might not, critics say, be as sort of effective as we sometimes like them to be, because they're an expression of clicktivism. And that's this sort of derogatory name for, like, you just click somewhere, click here to save the world, click here to stop famine, click here to put an end to sexism. But from the sort of conventional perspective of social engagement, you don't need to make any sacrifice. It takes no time. You don't need to change your life. You don't even have to sort of move out of your seat. You just click and agree, which means that if it would come to going out in the streets and actually protesting about these things, maybe a very small fraction of these people who clicked would do it. And therefore critics have said, well, this is not real activism, it doesn't count. And from another perspective, you can say this is a new form of activism, which is much more powerful in some respects, but maybe according to the previous ways of measuring or valuing engagement, it seems like it's sort of clicktivism, or as sometimes called slacktivism as well. So that was also a thing I wanted to see, how the level of engagement, which of course needed to be defined in a way so that I could measure it. So then when it comes to method, this is something that, as I publish in more sociological journals, I seldom present myself as a data scientist. But rather there's this idea within internet research about something called ethnography. You're supposed to document what happens online, a form of ethnography of the internet. And in classical ethnographic literature, it's about providing a thick or rich description of the context. And that doesn't mean that you should go do ethnography with field notes and interviews. You could also then, in your ethnographic approach, use both conventional sociological methods and combine them in a mixed methods approach with data science methods, computational linguistics methods, and that it's sort of about also embracing the sort of messiness that exists, because you need to use different methods for different challenges, I would say. So therefore, I wouldn't say that I have like a strict toolbox of like 4 computational methods that I used and that I am very rigorous about, and that I sort of, I guess people who do data science would say that I'm cheating, and sociologists would say that I'm cheating because I'm sort of mixing things up and trying to make stuff work, which is sort of a convenient position to be in, but it's also not popular always, neither in like the quantitative methods or the qualitative methods as they are conventionally defined. Just a very brief note on the theoretical context of this study. There's this sociologist called Irving Goffman, who was mostly active in the 60s, who presented something he called frame analysis. It has to do with the processes where people collectively and socially define a situation. Like, for example, in this room, what's the frame here? It's the frame of a lecture, which defines your role and your behavior and my behavior. Then someone can come in here with a bottle of champagne and some canapes or something, and we redefine the situation as an after party or something. And then the frame changes, but it's still sort of on top of this lecture. But yeah, you see how you define social situations. And in social movement literature, this notion of frames has been used like with the framing that a movement uses to mobilize. Like, what is our common conviction? What is the thing that we believe in? What's our ideology? And in this literature from the 80s, Bamford and Snow, they talk about collective action frames and collective action. That demands you sort of gather together somehow, preferably physically, agree on your ideas in meetings and conventions and stuff, and then you take to the streets or whatever you do as a form of collective action. And that demands very much that you're a homogeneous group. Then this actually award-winning paper as well from 2012, in relation to this literature, Bennett and Segerberg say that online now, it's not so much about collective action frames, it's about personal action frames. And a hashtag, for example, can be a personal action frame. That I can be alone and I pick up this Me Too hashtag, which makes me part of this collective without ever going to a meeting. Which means that I can then, by using the hashtag, engage in something they call connective action rather than collective action. And then the next question is connective action as efficient or even more efficient than collective action? Or is it sort of variants of the same thing, or are they different and so on? But this is sort of the theoretical context where I discuss this. I say that this literature sort of indicates that there are elements of both collective and connective action in today's social movements. And what's the case in Me Too? So then turning to methods, the first thing I wanted to look at was this challenge of noise and dilution, as I call it. And that's basically, I mean, the social media setting is notoriously noisy. I mean, there's lots of things on the internet. And also in the age of fake news and post-truth and phenomena as trolling and sort of being insincere for its own sake, and also sabotaging, disrupting, it's not a very like clear platform as writing an editorial in a major conventional newspaper, for example. So this means that a challenge for a movement is to sort of maintain its frame, so the frame is not diluted or dissolved and becomes sort of stained with other stuff. And what I did then, in order to study whether the movement was able to maintain its focus, is that I did this, that I will talk a bit more practically about later. But this is then a topic model. So I took all these 3 million tweets, and I fitted a topic model using this method called Lda to this corpus of tweets. And I instructed the sort of programming package, the Lda algorithm, to try to describe these 4 million tweets in terms of 500 topics. And that's a whole discussion with Lda, that you have to define a number of topics. The algorithm, the method, doesn't suggest a number of topics for you. So you can say, so the idea is that you try with different numbers of topics and see which gives the best fit. But I wanted to sort of go with a very broad tool throughout this corpus of tweets. And then to explain this figure, then this is the time axis of the tweet. So this is day 1 and this is day 60. From the day 1 is this Alyssa Milano tweet suggesting that we should use me too as a marker. That she didn't use the hashtag actually, but what started around this tweet. And then methodologically, I decided that I divided this corpus of tweets into 60 slices. So every day is one document in the analysis. So the first document is a text file containing all the tweets that were posted on day 1. Then the second document contains all the tweets that was posted on day 2, and so on. And then with this type of method, you get to know which, you get a range of topics that are suggested. And these are the sort of most sort of prominent topics that were found. And you can see that these are topics about sexual harassment in general. These are the sort of top words that match these topics. This is about the women that were credited with starting a movement. This is about sharing and telling and speaking up and telling the truth and sharing experiences. This is about some name dropping about both people that are exposing perpetrators and also those who become exposed. There's something about rape and harassment, some details about that, and also something that's more about movement and campaign vocabulary. So these are the topics are packages of words that are likely to occur together in the tweets. And then we get data for the probability by which a tweet will occur during a certain day. So what I did then was that I entered a dot on each place for each topic that was more likely than 0.3 to occur at a given day. So that's quite, I mean, that's an arbitrarily set threshold. I decided that's a strong topic. So this means that on day 1, there were a set of topics that were above this threshold. For example, topic 70, topic, I think it's 137, and so on. And what I used this analysis for was two things. First, I could see that there were a set of topics, these gray lines, that were sort of occurring continuously throughout all the first 60 days. Which means that this method could be used to sort of say, what was the main discourse, what was talked about? And I could say, like, these topics out here, they were sort of the main Me Too discourse, which is sort of confirmed what we would believe it was from our knowledge of this movement. But then it would also show then that actually, if we look at this closer, it's more focused around these strong topics here, and then there's sort of a feeling that more noise is added throughout. So I tried to develop this further, and I'm advancing on the wrong machine. I'm not a statistician. I realize this is a very weak tendency, but at least I was able to show that the number of strong topics per day in these 3.8 million, actually in this case, tweets, were sort of increasing. That on day 1, this was the number of strong topics, and on day 50, this was the number of strong topics. I think these results were not really conclusive, maybe, but a sort of, we could speculate maybe that the noise increases, or maybe that's just a natural process. The longer an issue exists, the more other things are tied to it. But at least it's a very explorative and experimental analysis. So this was what I was able to do with the topic model thing. So that was the issue about noise. Then it was this thing about hate and trolling, like to what extent was the Me Too tweets sort of taken over by negative sentiments, or to what extent could we find hate or disruption or anti-feminism in these tweets, and to what extent did it continue to be these sort of positive tweets about speaking up and being strong together and so on. And this is also like a very rough way, like going from that whole complexity, I decided to try to make a sentiment analysis, like using a method that calculates a score for whether a string of text, a tweet, is positive or negative. So there are different methods for this. I used a library called Vader. That's an abbreviation for Valence, Aware, Dictionary, and something for calculating sentiment scores, which means that I took all the tweets, I cleaned them in different ways for different aspects of the analysis, and I'm not completely on top of things right now, but you see it's a lower number here. I think this was where I just kept the English language ones to do the sentiment analysis, and I also you saw that it was prominently English language topics that popped out in the other one, but for that analysis I actually also had the other languages in there. So this algorithm would calculate then a score saying that if you get a tweet, I'll show you, this is an example of tweets that score on the plus side. It goes from -1 for negative sentiment to +1 for positive, maximum positive sentiment. And this is an example of a tweet that scored 0.2, which in this context is quite positive. This is 0.4. You see, these are the example tweets for these scores that this algorithm that includes a dictionary of words that are tagged with whether they are positive or negative, and it's also another algorithmic dimension to this tool. It's just not straight word matches, it has another way of sort of weighting stuff as well. These would be examples of the negative end of the spectrum, where example tweets that match the negative sentiment would be such tweets. And what I found in this analysis, I'm not sure if you're allowed to do this either, but what I did was that I inverted the scores so that both the positive and the negative, you're probably allowed to do this, so both the positive and the negative scores were positive, so that I could overlay the curves. And the interesting thing I found was that on day 1, the positive scores were up here, and then on day 2, I guess, the negative scores started to take over, to dominate over the positive ones. And then here, something happened. And I was able to validate that too, because this was around the day when Time magazine made Me Too the person of the year, the movement or the silence breakers, the women who spoke up about this were made the person of the year. So this could then be analyzed in many ways, and as I have my mixed methods approach, I would not rely on an image like this. I would say that it seems to be something here, and then I would move on to look at tweets or examples like this. And it's also, of course, a complexity here, because this is a very negative tweet, but it's not negative towards the movement. It's negative towards those who are negative towards the movement. So then it's rather, maybe you could rather say that this indicates that it's an increased antagonism in the discourse, that it's more sort of harsh words are spoken, and they can be in both directions. But at least it says something. It's interesting as a starting point for moving further with analysis, whether it's like a qualitative analysis, which is impossible to do covering this number of tweets, but you can also move between the aggregate and the very detailed level. Let's see what I did with this. This was also, I guess, examples of these negative tweets that go in both directions. Yeah, the third issue I had was this thing about collectivism and disengagement. Like, to what extent were the tweets simply just echoed, like people doing lazy stuff such as "Me Too is good," retweet, like, and to what extent did people actually take the time to craft their own tweets and post sort of original content, which would be sort of more engaged, I guess, to retweet something and add a comment, or to craft a tweet of your own and then add the hashtag rather than just repeating stuff. So for this, this is simple, I mean, descriptive statistics. I looked at mentions, how many, what share of tweets were mentioning other accounts, which means like speaking to someone else. How many were actually replies? These are not exactly the same things in the Twitter data, because a reply is sort of a mention, but a mention is not always a reply, because a reply means you press the reply button on Twitter and you get the username of the one you're responding to at the very start of your tweet. A mention is basically you write a sentence and then you add a username somewhere in there. And then it's the retweets, where you just push the retweet button and you echo the tweet, basically. And there's also research done, what does a retweet mean? It's not always an endorsement and so on, but at least it says something about the social act. And this is also me playing around a bit with the data, because it's a percentage per day, for example. So if you have the days where there are more tweets than other days, it doesn't show. So this is just the proportions. And I could draw some conclusions, like more than 60% were mentions and replies in the beginning, and actually just 5% were retweets, which is a low number. There's studies made about tweets in general that say how many tweets are retweets in general. I think it's 16% or something. Then the retweet proportion was growing around here, and the direct replies were dropping. And I said something here that there was a decline in replies and mentions here, and 30% were retweets. Yeah. It's not surprising results, but it's a possibility to show, like with actual data, that there was a higher degree of engagement here, which means that the Me Too campaign wasn't the same on day 1 and day 14, for example. And then the last step of this very experimental analysis, I sort of went crazy with this idea of mixing data of various quality from different platforms and so on, but still tried to do something. So I had my tweets, and this is sort of an intensity score. So going from day 1 to day 14, this is the percentage of tweets, how they were distributed over time. And if I paired that very large data set of 3 million tweets with the more fragmented data for YouTube uploads that match Me Too search, and I looked at blog posts on Tumblr, which is sort of an accessible platform to get data, and I also did this very manual thing, looking at activity in closed Facebook groups, because then you can query Facebook for how you can see, by querying it every day, you can see how the private closed groups grow, and you can see sort of an approximation of activity, but you don't see the actual content in the group. Which means that these are 3 million tweets, and this is maybe activity in a small number of groups. But still, it could be used as a starting point for discussion of whether it became less interesting on Twitter proportionally, and it moved on to other platforms. And if we take it to its extreme, with all its flaws in this analysis, we would say the movement was sort of chased back into a private sphere, or it went into closed groups to mobilize and coordinate and come back even stronger. But that's about the conclusions of the study, and what I was aiming to show here is basically more the types of analysis. And just what I discussed here theoretically then was in this context of sociological theory and the notions of connective and collective action and different platforms and phases and so on. I had this idea that maybe the connective action is more important in the early stages of movement, but then movements still need to mobilize collectively to survive, and that some of these data could be helpful in showing that. Yeah? Yeah.
Are there any questions for Simon? Yeah.
There was a marked decline in the number of replies relative to mentions. But do you have, how should one understand this? Do you have a feeling for, I mean, you said that replies were when you make a direct reply while mentions, when you mention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there some, do you have an explanation for why there's such a clear decrease in the number of replies relative to mentions? Is it just because mentions are like media coverage?
I think that could be one explanation. Like that if you retweet and share lots of news and stuff, it's in there, and that the replies would be more about this. We could only speculate, but I think about this more direct communications where people say, I've noted that she has shared her story and now I'm sharing mine, and you were so strong, now I'm doing this. That's sort of a hypothesis that you could have. So I think there's a difference to it that mentions, can be more part of like, when someone mentions a politician or when someone mentions someone that has been targeted by this campaign or someone who has been a high-profile person in the campaign. But the direct replies is more when like a hashtag is really sort of alive with the communication. But yeah. 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 Yeah, which part of the analysis?
So when you had like the scoring.
Yeah, that's the text, the sentences. No, it's the full sentence, and actually it's the full tweet in this case. Even if it's in these cases, even if it's more than one sentence.
Because but like a negative score.
Yeah.
Someone they tried something negative.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's probably the weight of each word.
Yeah, I mean, the sentiment analysis algorithms and packages are designed a bit differently. I mean, some of the most basic ones, they just provide like a list of negative words and a list of positive words, and sometimes with a scoring of how negative and how positive they are. And then it would just split the sentence into words and then calculate a score according to some logic. And not knowing the exact details of this, but this method I used here, the way they argue for the strength of the method is that it's both a dictionary and also some sort of weighting that I think is somehow supposed to be sensitive to sort of the semantic of the sentence, like which order words comes on. But it's sort of a blunt tool like sentiment analysis, but yeah, so it's both simply scoring the words, but sometimes there's more. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you just get some sort of intensity score of a sentence rather than what, you don't get to know what it's negative or positive against. So then you need to contextualize that in other ways. Yeah?
Because I want to follow up on that. There is actually no way of contextualizing that. And that is sort of one of the problems with a lot of these types of studies. Because you get this negative, positive thing.
Yeah.
And in the end, you actually have no understanding of what people are positive for and what people are negative for.
No.
And so, it's not just like a small, I don't know, I suppose that's my challenge. You're going to convince me otherwise.
Yeah.
I think it becomes a really big problem because, like, you're saying negative things about its negative things.
Yeah.
But most of the stuff probably written about Me Too was positive about the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
Tell me, what do you think is a percentage positive things written about the Me Too movement versus the percentage negative things overall? 30%
positive, I would say.
30%?
Yeah, that's just
do you mean positive by the supporting Me Too?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Really?
Yeah, that's my feeling.
So even though your graph had had almost 50-50.
I realize now because I went with my feeling now and not the graph. No, but obviously it seems to be quite even. But my feeling is that the negative side is stronger than the positive one.
But I mean, I didn't see a single negative thing about Me Too.
No.
So who is seeing all those negative things?
They're in a different filter bubble.
Yeah.
I guess.
This is very, very difficult to believe.
Yeah.
It depends on who you're following, right, in Twitter. So your followers set the stage for what you see.
Yeah, I mean, on my Twitter, I just see positive things because I follow academics and people who share my political opinions and that type of thing.
I follow football fans, working class males in Britain.
Yeah.
I
so
have
that's surprising.
Identities, and one identity, I'm actually an incredibly obsessed terrorist. So I think I just do it for research reasons, but you see completely different universes.
Yeah.
Right? It's crazy.
No, but obviously it's a very blunt tool, and I think what it might be used for is sort of it's a temperature meter, at least maybe, that says something about conflict or consensus, or like the level of antagonism, whatever that antagonism is about, or something, I guess. But yeah, but it needs to be like, you need to do other analysis as well. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we try to do topic analysis on clean set of tweets from only one language, because it struck me that the topics that were sorted out by the algorithm were the fact that there were more of them towards the later stages of your data collection, just simply reflect that more people were expressing themselves in other languages.
Yeah.
And it's not noise; it's the same topics,
Yeah.
just
You mean
differently phrased.
Yeah, you mean the topic analysis, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's obviously a flaw in that, because I mean, if you have lots of languages, you will get, I mean, I had 500 topics for that one, but I mean, you see that, for example, German, it occurs as one topic, because it's not enough stuff in German for it to become different topics, but it sees, the algorithm notes that these words seem to occur together. So it identifies language.
And if you run only on the English language?
No. And that's also, I mean, this is because I mean, with my perspective on this, I'm like a novice with these methods. I try to incorporate them and try to work like out some sort of framework where it's data science, but it's still in the context of some sort of interpretive framework where I sort of, it's experimenting. I'm discovering these methods too, which means that I'm not always consistent. I mean, I can realize that, well, for the sentiment analysis, I said, well, let's just do the English. For the topic analysis, I didn't. So I'm not rigorous about these methods, which is a problem.
You can put it under future research.
Yeah.
Idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we should move on to your Jupyter show. Do you think 35 minutes is enough?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So I just have a incognito.
So let's see if it's. We didn't try this before now. Looks promising. Yeah. So I was asked to show also, I mean, this I guess becomes a bit of layered, because what you're teaching on this course, you're doing Databricks and Scala and that type of thing.
We can absorb all this to one Spark. So
and what I'm doing is that to the degree that I can do some programming and coding, I've learned to do it in Python. And I've done it in these Jupyter notebooks, and I tried to sort of structure the workflow that I used in this paper in a set of steps here. And I think we'll try as good as possible to show it live. There are sort of elements in this that take some time, and I'll try to prepare so we can just skip that and go read data from files that I have prepared. So we'll see, since it's unrehearsed. But this is, you can see this. Maybe it's
just a bit bigger.
we can zoom this a bit.
Shift Control Plus.
I'm using a Mac, so Shift Control Plus. Yeah, is this good? Yeah. So this is a. Yeah, you started out with Databricks, though, like the notebook type of environment and such is familiar. This also, I mean, you all have different backgrounds. This is just once more a reservation that I consider myself like an amateur at these things, and I try to incorporate in my research as a sociologist. So you might spot things here where I do things in ways that seem counterintuitive, or maybe even I've gotten things wrong if you're good at these things, but at least it's a workflow that's been functioning for me. So for the data collection of tweets, have you covered that yet, or you will do?
No, I'll be covering that because
Yeah.
they need to learn Spark streaming.
Yeah,
first.
but for the data collection, I have on actually my blog, the website here, something that I developed with a couple of colleagues, or it was mostly me. We call it Back to Future Tweet Collector because it does something. It uses two aspects of the Twitter API. The idea behind this back to future thing was that you first go back and then you jump to the future. Because if something takes off on social media, let's say we notice that some major event is happening. We've been studying terror attacks, for example. It takes off, and then you say, we need to set up a data collection for this. Then you can, by Twitter's API, get 7 days back in time before the tweets disappear from the public archive. And you can always stream them in real time to collect them as they happen. So if you're then, like, say, anywhere less than 3 days late, or 7 days late, sorry, we define the search terms and then go back in time to get the things that have already happened. And then we start streaming in real time. And this can be written in much more efficient ways. So this is sort of, everything I do is sort of hacky. I'm still very proud of myself for doing this. So, and I enjoy it. So, but this blog post, it's on simonlindgren.com, has actually both, you can download this and run it. But as it's sometimes messy with, you need to set up your Twitter credentials and stuff. So just for the data collection bit, I actually made a little video. So we should not run into any problems. So this is, I tried to sort of do a voiceover for this video, but this is the tool on the website then. And this is the way I work with Me Too. And you need to go to the Twitter application management site where you're logged in with your Twitter account to create a set of credentials, so like codes to log in. And you can basically enter anything on this still. We'll see what happens now as everyone is changing their terms, but I think Twitter sort of takes pride in being quite open. So you create an application, and then within this application, you get served up 4 different codes. And you're not anonymous here, obviously. You see my little icon up in the right corner. Twitter will know that this was accessed through my account. These are my credentials, but you can create as many as you like, because sometimes you need more than one if you have several projects running. And you see in the video here, what's happening is me in this Python script for collecting the data, I'm entering the codes that I have to run this one. And sometimes I run several jobs with the same credentials. Sometimes they stop working, so I generate new ones. But this is how it would be done. And I have one script called search.py, which is the one that uses the search API to go back in time. And then I have another script that's called stream.py, which does the same for. So this is me then in a folder with terminal. And I'm listing to see the files, which is the files that you would get if you would download this exact way that I've written this. And then let's see what I'm doing next. Yeah, I'm running a script to create 2 databases. So this script dbs-py will create, you see, first database created and second database created. Because this is how we do it. We write it, the things going back in time into one database, the historical tweets, and then the things happening in real time and live tweets. And then we merge them once data collection is done. And then I just edit, this is just the way I set it up. I just edit a file that includes the search strings that I want to stream for. And with this example then, it's Me Too, but I can add others. And it's like, it will get anything, it's not like, it doesn't have to be all of these words. It will get any tweet with any of these words. And then let's see what I'm doing. I'm starting the live stream, and it's like, you see that now it's running. This was done a few days ago. And as it's running, it will print out here. It's gotten 2 tweets in real time now, 3, and then it keeps running. And then we can just keep this running on the server as a streaming job, collecting tweets for as long as we need. It will write to the database. I think I went to 15 or something before I switched when I did this video. Yeah, and then as they are running in real time, I also start, I do this in this order so I don't get a gap. This is then searching backwards in time. It's searching the tweets that are already there. So you can see the clock is moving backwards in time and it's getting tweets. And it will need to pause sometimes because of the rate limits of the server. So sometimes it will stop for 10 minutes and then keep on going. And the script has a certain number of days. I think we go 3 days back.
This is REST API.
Yeah. And then I run this to merge the databases, which is a script to merge the databases, which means that I now have this tweets.db, which is an SQLite 3 database with tweets. And I think that's the end of the video. And with this data collection then, I had collected around 3 million tweets, and they were in this SQLite 3 database format. So what the script basically does, it says that get the tweet item from the Twitter API, and that's sort of a data object that has a lot of different, we call them, Ras? Different keys, different categories, different elements. You can get like, when was it posted, by whom, is it a retweet, does it include hashtags and things like that. So this is just me in Python importing the necessary libraries. When you work with text in their pandas libraries, you need to set a certain, that you have sort of infinite column width so it doesn't truncate your tweets. Then I have commented this out, but I connect to the database. I select from the table in the database the everything from the tweets database, and I then do some cleanup, which is to remove line breaks in the tweets basically, but everywhere, and removing tabs, and also the other type of line break that can be there as well are removed. But just to make sure I have the same data that I want to illustrate with, I have commented that out, and then I read this data frame. So it's Control Enter, I guess, on this one as well. Yeah. So now it's reading. Now I'm doing this live, so we'll see from my server. It's reading this file. This is just a warning. It's not an error message. So we'll disregard of that. I'm reading this table of tweets into a data frame, which is a certain data storage format in Python using the pandas library. And then this is just checking like the length of the data frame, which shows that it's this particular version, which is the one I ran the sentiment analysis on, is 2.6 million. Then this is a command to just read the data frame and show the head, which is the first 5 lines, and we can see what type of data we'll have. It's like the index, it's the date, it's who posted it, it's the text, and it's also a column for day that I created for some sorting purposes. That's sort of just coming off this created at column, which can also be parsed, so we don't need this day-1, so that's a workaround. But then I'm doing lots of data cleaning stuff here, because in this data frame I have the text column, which is the tweets, and to do some of the analysis, I just, for each tweet in this column, I convert it to lowercase. I remove all the hashtags, because I use the hashtag as like a sampling method, but for this analysis I'm not interested in the hashtags. Then I remove all the links. I remove all the words that starts with HTT. I remove all the usernames, because that's not what I'm interested in either, like all the words that start with that. Sometimes the links doesn't start with HTT, so then I remove every word with a slash in it as well, which will obviously, if someone writes love/hate, I will remove that as well, so it's not perfect. Then I remove all the retweets. I remove some punctuation, and then I just write these to a list called tweets. Called tweet. So we'll see if I run this in the, I guess you should start it and then talk about it. Yeah, but it's processing the tweets now, and you can see already here, because I've already run this before, that this is the list of the cleaned tweets. This is the end of the list, and this is the beginning one. And then I use this to add this column called tweets to the data frame. So I have both the text column, which is sort of the raw content, and then I have the column called tweets, which is the cleaned one. So this, for example, includes only a hashtag, so that's empty. This includes only hashtags and a URL, so it's empty. But these other ones are sort of you say, distilled down or cleaned up to be just the raw or the maybe purified text. So looking at the data frame here, this is what we have, and I did some operations here basically because I wanted to do topic modeling. So therefore I added a column that says which day are they from, and then this is just some steps to do this, as you won't be using this exact notebook. It's not important, but I created a day column here, even for the new data frame, and then I grouped them by day, so that it's not interesting who posted it or whatever, it's just like on which day were they posted. I create groups for that, and then the groups are in a list where I can see, this is just now outputting lots of stuff, but each item is all the tweets that were posted in one single day, and now it's outputting it on top of each other, so you won't see, but you see the first line where it's outputting it. So what I've been doing then is just I create a folder, and in that folder I iterate over each group, and for each group I create a text file, which means that I will end up with a folder where I have this tweets column, which is 2.6 million lines, packaged instead in one file per day. So
That becomes your document for it.
that becomes my document for the LDA, because I won't do a topic modeling based on each tweet. I see each day as a document, like which topics are on which day. So this is, I mean, it's an example of what types of steps you need to go through with the data. So this is the second one then. This is where the types of steps to do the LDA, the topic modeling, import the relevant libraries, and set up the analysis, and then I read the files that I created, all the files that are in this folder for each day. And if I count the files there, it's 296, which means that 296 days, or is it? I'm not sure. I have a sort of a mess with, I have sliced it in different ways, but it's like more likely 90 days or something, but disregard of that, because it may be that I'm reading from another TM files folder here than the one I created in the last step. So then I'm using a stop word list to remove some stop words, like the very common words. I tokenize the documents so they are sort of in this format where each document is a list of words, and then I also remove all words that appear only once. Then comes the LDA process, for which I'm using this gensim Python library, and with this you go about in this way. You set up the corpus, which is a vectorization, which means that you convert the documents, instead of them being a list of words, it's a series of numbers, just stating you have a dictionary. You create a dictionary based on your texts, where each word that exists has a certain number, and then each document becomes a vector just saying which dictionary numbers are represented in that document. And then there's also some parameters here where you can say that filter out words that occur in less than so and so many documents, and or in more than such and such percentage of the documents. So I've also set up some of those things there. Then create the corpus, and then we could see that we have 66,000 unique words in 291 documents in this case. Then it's about training the LDA model, which is what I'm commented out, because that takes a lot of time, especially if you run it with enough iterations and passes. But I set it up to generate 500 topics. This is a machine learning algorithm, so it outputs different things depending on how much it gets to work. But this loops through the entire corpus 15 times, and it runs through each document 50 times. I've been playing around with different things, reading tutorials and stuff. This is obviously what I used, and then evaluate every second. So then it's just calling this function in this library, which is pre-written to create an LDA model. Use the corpus I created, use the dictionary I created, use the number of topics and all these parameters that I just defined here. And then it fits this model. And then you can view the topics. And rather than running it, I just inserted an image here where, I mean, you will get topics like these. These were the topics that formed the basis for this graph with all the dots that I showed you. So in order to produce that graph, what I did was that you convert this model into a matrix as well, where you have basically this. This is the day, and this is topic 0, and this is topic 1, topic 2, up to 500 for each day. And it was from this one that I also set this threshold for what's a strong topic. So it's this data matrix that sort of forms the basis for the visualization that I showed you with the dots, because now we have, it's just these data that we need. We have each day, and we have each topic, and we have the topic probability per day.
So all those numbers sum to 1 for each day, right?
Yeah, that's also a thing with LDA, that it assumes that all topics are represented on all days, but they can be just 0.0000 something. So it's a probability score, so it sums up to 1. And then for the next step here, it was about the plotting. So then I'm sort of importing, for example, this Seaborn plotting library and some other plotting stuff. And then I just read this topic model table that we just created in here. I now read it from file instead because it didn't run all the steps. And then let's see if it was, I said 0.3. I don't know in what context I did this, but it's actually as low as 0.01 because that's how the topic scores look. I might have remembered it incorrectly from some other context. So I set a threshold, and it was actually this threshold. And then I created a list of which were the strong topics for each day, which ended up with this list that on the 13th, this is just the top of the list. It starts then listing the topics that were above the threshold for that day. So we can show some more maybe, and we'll see that when it switches over to, this is the number of topics that were, so this will be the dots for first day, then for the second day, and so on. And this is the topic number that we see. Yeah, so then this is basically, let's see if I can even there run the plot live. Yeah, so this is sort of, I've done some obviously edits to make the plot look nicer in the thing I showed you in the presentation, but this is the sort of the raw version of this. And I also then reformatted data a little bit to produce this graph as well. Yeah. And let's see what I did in step 4. I don't remember. Yeah, that's the sentiment analysis. Yeah. So then this is the Vader library. I also have, if you're interested in trying out sentiment analysis, on my website, I mean, I'm by no means affiliated by those who created this library, but I tend to write these small tutorials just to remember myself how I did it. So there's also on my blog or website, it's there's a small tutorial for that. But let's see, where's step 4? Yeah, so importing the sentiment analysis library, then I read the text column from the Twitter dataset that we collected, which is, yeah, I'm not going to run this now. And then it, yeah, that's why it doesn't work, because I intended to skip some text cleaning and filtering steps here. We reread the tweets from this pre-processed file. And then this is also something that we probably won't have time to wait for, but then it runs, I tell it to create an empty list called Vader scores. And then for each sentence, this with the number of docs is just to output this counter. But for each sentence in this list of sentences, it uses the Vader library to calculate this score. And then this is just for every 1,000 sentence output this counter, so it's a bit more messy than it maybe needs to be. So as you see, this will take some time, so we'll just read further. I mean, then I go through the sentences and the scores to create a dictionary where each sentence is connected to its score, which makes it possible to output a data frame like this, where I have a certain tweet, and this is a compound score. That's what I used for my analysis. It's a sort of weighted, aggregated version of this, but it also has like a positive score, a neutral, and a negative. That's a bit more refined.
Are you also removing the URLs and things like that from the actual raw text?
I think I did, but in order to make these notebooks possible to run live, because I didn't have a very structured workflow. You see, I've been reading from different. This is one backup file, which is the one I think I used, but now to move further, I used another. So I think when I originally did this, this was the clean version. Yeah, but so you have to sort of take it with a pinch of salt. Yeah, but yeah. So then basically, once I have this data frame, it's just basic plotting of lines that I did. I mean, there's some steps here to sort of get to where we want to be, but basically it's about isolating like the text and the compound score, which is sort of what you would do in Excel or wherever, and then this is the plot that then ended up in the presentation. It's using this matplotlib library and defining just characteristics of the lines and colors and stuff. And this is me playing around with some other variants of showing stuff before I gave up somewhere, obviously. Yeah, so I mean, and so I just those were the analysis I plan to show, and I mean, it's just browsing through them like this. I guess the thing that could be useful is just to see, like, under the hood, what types of things you would do in order to produce the types of stuff that I had in that presentation. And I think also somehow maybe this sounds like I'm sort of saving face, but I mean also just showing the messiness of this, that it's a bit hacky and that I don't really know the exact steps, and you backtrace what you've done and you sort of realize new things all along. It's part of the process as well, I think. So I think for me to see something like this would sort of take away some of the drama to try to do it yourself.
Yeah. Another good question. You know your positive and negative plots.
Yeah.
Dark black, which is negative, and the dotted one, which is positive, I guess.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, so obviously the negative scores
are positive.
Actually, the black one is negative, right?
Yeah.
So the negative one itself is of two types, like say bold gray and bold black. Let's say the bold gray is the negative of the negative, that you pointed out some examples.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can just look at the username of the negative of all the negative ones.
Yeah.
And then find out if that username has said anything positive in the past, just to color.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's a stupid, silly thing, but I'm curious if this was maybe when David was perhaps. So maybe then the number of positives will be much bigger overall. You know, if we consider negative as a negative as positive.
Yeah.
Me too, then.
Yeah, because this is basically not what users have said, this is what days have said.
Right.
Like the speaker here is the day.
Okay.
Because it's the sentiment score of the stuff that was posted on that day.
Right.
So it depends on how you slice the documents as well.
Okay, under the assumption that the user is not changing his or her mind in the last 30 days.
Yeah. 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 So yeah, I think that's it for this.
These notebooks, have you put them also in the public domain? So you like to go through them?
Yeah, we can do that. I mean, I've sent them. I've sent them to you, and I mean, also I'm running this now off my office sort of server computer, because to run them straight off means that you have to have the right libraries set up and installed and so on, and that's not done. But I mean, in this raw form, of course, it's I have no problem with sharing them, as long as, I mean, maybe something with the data that's referenced in there that you should be careful about, because it's been collected according to some terms of service or whatever. But yeah, you just take them for what they are. They're provided as is with no guarantees.
I can make them available. Also, the video that Simon showed, that's assigned work. You guys all need to bring your own credentials for tomorrow morning. So we will, each one of us will actually do our own experiments live from tomorrow, but in a fully scalable way. So
because I mean, the things that you will be showing, I guess, is to do similar data collection, but in the Scala environment, or in
so you can scale to terabytes, whatever. So it's completely scalable. So Simon will be limited by the RAM and the disk space of this Linux.
Yeah, and also, of course, it's this reservation that when we access the API, this public streaming API, we're not guaranteed to get everything, because you need paid access to Twitter to get everything. It's all these reservations. You can get everything, but if the things you're streaming for is more than 1% of the Twitter output at any given time, it will be sort of capped and so on. So it's always like, given I don't have all the Me Too tweets from this moment in time, probably, because there have been times when it was exceeding, so it was filtered. But yeah.
Are there any questions for Simon? Just a few more minutes.
One other, in your talk previously, you showed us that the Twitter impact was large in the beginning, and at the end there was more closed Facebook groups, etc. And I was just curious, how do you get the data from closed Facebook groups?
Yeah. First of all, I'll repeat the reservation that that conclusion, which is sort of the conclusion I want to get across, it's a big push, because I mean, it's not basic. It's more, that graph more shows that like each platform for itself, the Twitter activity tended to be concentrated to the beginning of this phase, and the Facebook activity tended to be concentrated towards the end. But the sizes of these are proportionate to each platform. So it seems like in my figure that Facebook is sort of taking over Twitter, which it in numbers didn't do. But then how I got from closed Facebook groups, that was like, as I also mentioned, one of these more gray area types of analysis, because if you go to Facebook and you find a closed group, you will get very limited data, but it will output something like the number of members, something about a rough number for the new members in the last, I don't know if it's last day, last week, last month or something, and something similar for posts. So what I did was basically that I did manual daily lookups on, say, 10 of these larger groups, and made a very rough like data sheet showing that, well, it increased like this, and it's as it has this volume now, we can sort of backtrack. So it was really hacky and cut and paste. You don't get that data really. So that's also like this balance, like you take this sort of patchy, obscure, problematic data, and you present this type of figure and say maybe it says something, or from another perspective you can say we shouldn't even go near that, we should use the data that we can control, and so on. And as I mentioned, I've sort of chosen the path because I mean, I'm not trained in these fields, so for me it's like I pick and choose and see what happens. And I'm thinking I'm sort of at the point in my career when I can allow myself to play around as well. But I'm depending on what you're supposed to use these methods for and why you're taking a course like this. I guess also my sort of loose take on stuff may not be for everyone. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, I think in the afternoon you're going to be talking about the UK election, general election.
Yeah, something about social network analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, social network analysis. And after Simon, I will talk about what I did with the US election and SPL, US Southern Poverty Law Center defined hate groups. But my approach is, of course, statistical. So I will be doing large-scale non-parametric hypothesis tests to answer questions like, did hate, people who subscribe to hate groups retweet Trump significantly more often than you would expect under a very explicit model of randomness. So the idea is that what Simon's doing is extremely important, I think, and valuable, because he's really pulling up his sleeves and machete doing stuff. And of course, that's, I think, a very important step before you can do the explicit hypotheses to test.
Yeah, but I think I'm also an interesting example of like one of these. I'm a social scientist, more maybe to the humanities side, who has devoted much of my career to being against quantitative methods, because that's how our field is defined.
Right.
And now going into this field, I'm sort of, you discover all these new tools and you get really excited, and you realize lots of times that you make mistakes and you reinvent the wheel as well. You think, oh, I've invented a method. And then you meet someone who say, well, this is what computational linguistics has done for 50 years and it's called this. So, that's part of the... But I think to me, it's just daring to try to do stuff even if you feel that you're not really comfortable. And I think it's... Maybe if you're safe I'm safe as a sociologist with my theories and stuff, and it doesn't matter if someone thinks that I'm not a real data scientist. Yeah.
Well, anyway, we're all human beings, so hungry, right? So
Yeah.
let's pick a coffee. So let's thank Simon once more.